I would like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC's Okanagan campus is situated on the traditional territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation and their peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that we are all joining this meeting from places near and far, and acknowledge that the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands.
Thank you, Abigail. So we are going to run through a short presentation. A range of us will be speaking, and happy to take questions afterwards. But Susan, I'll hand it over to you to start.
Okay. Yeah, most of the people here in this group are very familiar with the site, but nonetheless, we'll start with a bit of a site overview for anyone who's not, and a refresher for anyone who hasn't seen it for a while. The image on the right is our existing site, and you can see the stand of ponderosa pines there to the west of the site, the ravine on the east of the site, and we'll draw your attention to this existing service road that is running north-south on the site. And the general outline of where our site is of course just south of the EME building, which we see in the foreground here. And that is of course alumni just west of the site. So in terms of overview of the site constraints, this model helps us see the relationships, and we'll just draw your attention to the ravine again and the trees in that location. There is a holding pond just to the east of EME. Also at the base of this ravine, that is a secondary holding pond. And of course, there is the EME itself. This is more or less the outline of our site. And again, this is our existing service road that is getting repositioned. This is the stand of ponderosa pine trees to the west of the site. And then this is an existing service road going into a service area and into J lot. And of course, this is the urban edge along Alumni and John Hindle to the south there. So we wanted just to retouch on a summary really of our site response to these really unique conditions that we were given to work with. And so in this diagram, you can see the general grid of the campus, and this orange dotted line, that's connecting the Knowledge Lane Greenway. So that is a real opportunity to connect into our site and through to the site, framing views to the east. And so in this diagram, well, we can see there's sports fields to the west, and to the south there's potential residential and sports fields. Our site is the southern edge of the academic portion of the site and really provides a gateway onto the site as seen from John Handel and from afar. So it's when you're approaching the site, you're going to see some of those ponderosa pines we were talking about, and a kind of welcoming condition. And the massing strategy was to start with two piers that touch the site in a fairly gentle way, and then the massing above, which is shown in this dotted line, straddles the two piers. So we're connecting to landscape, and we're welcoming this green knowledge way through and under the site, and again framing these views to the east. So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to Stuart, who is going to elaborate on the programmatic response to site.
Thanks, Susan. In our initial investigation of the site and our translation of the program, we wanted to identify some key locations for arrival to the building. And typically, in a building of this type, that entry would be off the main street edges in a very deliberate way. This approach is very different. It's determined to retain the trees and retain as much of the landscape that passes through and under the building. The intention there is to be light on the land. And as a result, that generates two components on the lowest level, the ground floor entry level. And you can see on this diagram that we've identified points of entry around this central arrival area. They're both shown in the red dots here on the diagram. To the left-hand side is an area where the cafe will be located simply because it's adjacent to the street and an area of high activity. And behind it would be some of the initial Maker Lab activities that are going on associated with that. And the other base element is going to contain the very large lecture hall. That in itself presents us an opportunity to perhaps think about how that lecture hall could be used both in its traditional function, but also in other functions that might open up to the landscape. And as a result, the pedestrian pathways through the site lead us naturally to those entry points and lead us away from the street edge. Next slide. And then as we assemble up through the various levels of the building, there are 3 primary levels with a 4th floor mechanical penthouse. The intention is to arrange the program with a series of different components that encourage the interdisciplinary nature of this building. As a result, you'll see on the left-hand side of the diagram, labs that form quite a large component of the building will be stacked vertically through the northern edge of the building. And in addition, we have put the lower fidelity labs, the ones that require less level of servicing, into the southern arms of those wings. And in addition, you can see in the center of the building, what we refer to as the neck of the building, between those 2 wings, is the main social interconnected floor spaces. And that is also there to encourage interaction and moments of collision between people that are moving through the building. In addition to that, the stakeholder group has encouraged us to think about an intermixing of various functions. So you will notice in the lime green, some of the teaching functions are spread throughout the building on other floors. And the more collaborative interconnected zones are occurring at the corners where there's moments of respite for those to occur. The remaining blue areas are largely office components, faculty offices, and graduate student office space. And in addition, you'll see at the second level, above the ground, is this main circular meeting space. And clearly, very much intended to provide a very specific reference to the Indigenous programming that's within the building. And therefore, it's a very prominent element. And we have put it at the main arrival level, 1 level up from ground. Next slide. This gives you an indication of the overall massing of the building. You'll notice that the pathways to the building naturally gather you under the center. And that pathway allows us to move through and under the building. Next slide. And so this is a view as you approach off alumni. The intention here is to really open up the potential of that cross connection through to the landscape beyond and the view across the valley. You'll notice that the general character and nature of that space is to encourage a natural environment. We're looking at the potential for using that for outdoor learning, also the opportunity in extreme heated weather to provide shade areas, and at the same time, provide an interactive zone at the base of the building. You'll see here that on the left of the image is the cafe, and to the right of the image is the arrival to the main lecture hall. And the pathway that connects the 2 is that meandering connection through the site. Next slide. And I think I'm going to pass this over to, is Jason going to take this section?
I'll talk to the service plans, and then Jason's going to run us through the building plans. So we know in a format like this, it was much easier to read a site diagram than a site plan. Nonetheless, there are so many interesting and important things going on in the site. We are actually going to walk you through this more detailed site plan, and hopefully you can see it well enough in this format. So as we talked about these ponderosa trees, you'll see that they have a very critical line to which has to be protected for the roots and so on. You'll see that the dotted line here is showing the form above are two piers and the relationship to alumni. You'll see that where we showed previously a site on the site photos that the service road went north-south through the site. Now the service road that services the EME and the ICI comes in between the two. So this is a diagram, or on this plan, you're seeing the service road entry, which slopes into this workyard area. On the next slide, you'll see the turning radii and so forth. But you'll see that this is a shared workyard, and the services for and loading for the ICI building are on that north edge. We also wanted to point out before we leave the service area that this is the pad mounted transformer for those on the line who are interested in that. This is the existing generator through the site, and Byron will talk about this more during his landscape presentation, but there are accessible paths for wheelchairs, and we just wanted to point out the accessible parking is to the south at J-Log. There are 5 stalls accessible on this path showing here. And then of course you can see the nature of the ravine as you see the topography and the second holding pond down to the south. So Byron will talk more about landscape, just related to the site plan. He'll talk about the stormwater retention and the nature of the interfaces and so on. So we'll leave that for Byron to talk with. Here's just a blow up for anyone interested of how the turning radii work as you come down the service ramp. Some vehicles will go into this courtyard, and then there's turning for 10-meter long concrete trucks and other service trucks, bike storage, and our access to laboratory loading and general loading along the space. So at this stage, I'm going to pass it over to Jason to run through the plans.
Thank you, Susan. I'll spend a little bit of time talking through the ideas that bring the program into the goal set that's been established for the project. And, really those fall along sort of 3 trajectories. The first is, as the name of the project suggests, a kind of really robust interdisciplinary and collaborative mixing of program, which many of you know, I'm sure, is rather unusual for a research-oriented building. Here we have programs that run the gamut from sort of hard research sciences all the way through much more interactive and people-focused spaces like outwardly facing interview rooms and undergraduate focused classrooms and the graduate collegium. So our first obligation is to try to come up with a series of planning ideas and execute them to allow that interdisciplinary mixing. The second goal is really to, as Stuart suggested, make sure that the building is beautifully and enticingly integrated into the Okanagan landscape. And that is not only the building and the landscape, which Byron will speak to in the short term, but also to promote the really captivating view sheds that happen when you get on this site and up into the building section that reach both east and west, and to a certain extent north and south in a 360-degree panorama to engage the building into the landscape, not just locally, but remotely and regionally. And we hope that will have really important resonance with the goals for indigeneity for the project beyond the program pieces. And then the third obligation here is really to make sure that this makes a strong statement about inclusion in the campus itself. And of course, the campus has some legacy elements and some new elements, like all institutional campuses do. And we really see our obligation here in the planning of this building to make sure that it's beautifully integrated into the campus traffic and is a beacon for folks to come and experience the interdisciplinary nature of the work. So having set out all of those grandiose goals, I'll start with the kind of most pragmatic piece of the building, which is the below grade space, the basement space. So of course, the site has a pretty significant slope, as Susan pointed out. And so we're taking advantage of that to sort of earth bind the southern portion of the complex here, where we have mechanical service strategies, including a really important part of our low energy building design in the below grade labyrinth. And then in the northern part, where the site slopes away, we have the end of trip facilities such as loading, bike room, changing rooms, various infrastructural and mechanical spaces. And then importantly, for this notion of interdisciplinary mixing, a couple of the core labs, which are program components, which are university-wide resources beyond just the building themselves, but which generally contained highly specialized instrumentation and equipment that is sort of centralized and then shared out. And so the idea is that because people from across the campus, not just this building, but across the entirety of the university are using these facilities, we locate them throughout the vertical stacking element of the building in order to promote their utility and the kind of interaction that happens when different users come into contact in ways that they might not otherwise. You can go forward, please. Here you see the level 1, aka ground level plan at left, and Stuart and Susan both mentioned some program components there, and the level 2, 1 level above grade at right. So just starting with the left-hand diagram, we've really been careful to make sure that the priorities that I talked about campus and landscape engagement are highlighted here in the selection and dispensation of program. So in addition to locating the tiered lecture hall where it's heavily trafficked and probably most accessible on the ground floor, we've also put it into a position in which we hope, unlike most lecture halls, which tend to be buried in the kind of middle of buildings, it will have a pretty dramatic and wonderful connection to the exterior landscape, to both the views, to the water, to the trees that are immediately to the east of the building. And then it has a primary catchment area along the trajectory of access to its west. The opening between these two volumes then helps to both orient folks with daylight in view and helps to project the landscape through the building. And then the northern program components include those, as Stuart mentioned, that are very publicly accessible, like the cafe, and which are vertically connected in the building, like the commons in that sort of lighter orange color. That's the space that you'll see throughout the building that will connect the building vertically. And then what we think are a really interesting series of developments to bring what are traditionally upper floor research spaces down onto this ground floor to sort of put research, science, and associated activities on display. These in particular are a couple of teaching labs, which have obviously great connections between the undergraduate faculty and graduate communities, and so occupy a primary spot on that ground floor. The makerspace, which is used again by a multiplicity of users across the university and has a pretty public profile, and then some new spaces to the university's fabrication labs and design thinking spaces, all of which will form this kind of really rich mixture of teaching, learning, instruction, public and cultural connections that we think will make a tremendously vibrant ground floor. Moving up one floor, we see program components appear here, such as the community gathering space, the circular space in the waist or deck of the building, and then the Center for Indigenous and Interior Salish Studies, and the interview and participant research rooms. These are very publicly facing programs that want to have a fairly primary, but in some senses controllable connection to the public thoroughfare. You see there in that same location, as I believe Stuart mentioned, a connection between the ground floor lecture hall space and this program component. We also have really significant circulation vertically in the northern portion of the building, and then generally that northern portion contains The core facility, one or two of them each floor, as I mentioned earlier, kind of up through the building. Traditional wet laboratories, which are arranged in non-traditional ways. In other words, they have relationships to one another and to other public programs and private programs like offices, as you see here in blue, in really novel and intriguing interdisciplinary ways. A series of collaborative and meeting spaces, which are shown in the orange color here, arrayed throughout the floor plate, so as to gather people in interesting and you know, interdisciplinary collisions. And then a couple of types of offices, some private offices, recognizing the need for particularly faculty to have some sense of closure and privacy for confidential work. And then a series of open offices, which are generally servicing the graduate and maybe postdoctoral communities. And they're in proximity to the labs, but are open networks that allow for transit of those users between the labs and what were traditionally the write-up areas. We don't call them that anymore. They're generally co-lab areas. In other words, they're complementary to the hard lab spaces in a way that is much more fluid and much more contemporary, much more reflective of contemporary research. You can move up one slide, please. And then on levels 3 and 4, you'll see some consistent organizational models along the northern piece of the plan. And in particular here, you see a series of externalized circulation corridors on the westerly side. That does a couple of things. One is it brings daylight kind of in a more egalitarian way throughout the floor plate rather than it being used by single person offices, for example. It also allows for the activity of the building to kind of be put on display. That's the most publicly accessible, visually publicly accessible portion of the building. That'll be a little more evident in some of the views that Stuart and Susan talked to later. But we're essentially externalizing some circulation within a modest amount that allows for the traffic of the building and the energy of the building to sort of be seen from the outside. And then, as has been also mentioned, the classrooms, although there are a series of classrooms and teaching labs on that ground floor where they'll get really robust traffic and use, we're also spreading them out through the building. And this is intentional. The working group has been very specific in their feedback to try to bring these spaces up through the building. And then some of the complementary office spaces, classroom and research rooms, and then graduate, collegiate, and other spaces that are important for the wider campus networks. Go ahead up one slide. And then this is the rooftop level, which features the ever exciting mechanical penthouse, as well as some vertical light gathering devices. Go ahead forward. Just quickly through the sections, you can again here see the connectivity of landscape and the way that the building travels through that and embraces the landscape in ways that are really important and fundamental. And then, you know, simply the packing strategy to keep this building below the local airport authority's vertical limit and put it into some context with its neighbors, EME in particular. Go ahead forward. And then the longitudinal section at top, which again shows the vertical arrangement of the building, the pass-through, and then at bottom, that southerly portion. Go ahead forward. I'll turn it back over to my colleagues at HCMA.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So as we've been talking about as we go along here, our two piers, one to the north, one to the south, are what we consider to be kind of the land. So we're looking at those as having some solidity, and we're developing the language of some portent steel, which may peel away to show the entries to the building, and the glazing that allows for a lot of connection to those very active parts of the program that were specifically put into these piers, the classrooms, the makerspace, the cafe, etc. As we move along, it may be that the wheat-colored masonry is seen through those glazing moments into the building, so you may see that beyond. So on the upper portion, which hovers across the two piers, we're looking at how we might provide sun shading in each unique elevation and orientation, as well as really kind of express what's going on the inside of the building to the outside. So in these elevations, for instance, we can see the more visible kind of connection to the social heart of the building that we've been talking about. So you may see into the actual gathering space and understand by looking in where the circulation is. And as we move forward, we'll be fine-tuning the, I guess, irregularities and nuances that relate specifically to the program and the sun protection required. Materiality for the upper portion is being explored in a few different ways, including zinc, terracotta, and a couple of, we're working back and forth with the LAC or local analysis values in relation to how we can make the materiality portion of this building the most sustainable that we can. So at this time, we're going to have a look at landscape, and Byron, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. I'll just go through firstly the four sort of elements that we looked at the beginning. Was the indigeneity, well-being, sustainability, and flexibility. And I think that's apparent obviously through the architecture too, but it's a focus that we led our design process through for the landscape architecture portion of the program. So bear that in mind as we sort of look at the elements as we walk through the site. Stuart and Susan have mentioned already the main connection from north to south. Obviously, it's a focus from our point of view to create a strong backbone through the site for connectivity. Without knowing what's really going to happen in the south, we've obviously come up with a conceptual design right now for the schematic programming, connecting to the car park on the south being critical, and obviously understanding that future movement to the south will be delineated as and when development occurs. We have also focused on the northern section where we have a bit of a confluence of the EME ramp and northern campus connections, both along the EME frontage as well as to the northwest. And for that reason, we brought a single crossing across the street at that point, trying to separate it as much as we can from the vehicular interface with the EME ramp, and then creating a strong movement through from the northwest through to the east, which will then also connect through to the cultural garden aspects to the eastern side of the ponds. This main connection is focusing on accessibility. We're looking at SEPTED guidelines for this too. But one thing to add to it is we've also provided an idea of putting in a shoreline paving pattern along this main route, which I'm not sure is everywhere else on the campus, but it's something we utilize a lot in Kelowna, just to enable that if there is visually impaired users, you can have access through there, they can tap their way along the edge. So that's a critical part of this accessibility and universal accessibility for the paving and the movement through the site. Currently, we feel we have a 5% grade max that we can transition through the site. So that gives us a great access from north all the way through the south parking area. A big focus for us above and beyond the connectivity was separating passive and active spaces. So looking at it from a perspective of having the main active corridor running through the site north to south and then connecting to the southern block. The rest of the site, we were looking at trying to create that more of a passive congregational space, outdoor classroom opportunities, how we can bring in flexibility of use of the space, as well as looking at the indigenous side of the brief. And with that in mind, we've obviously got the constraints with the Ponderosa Pine Grove, stormwater catchment and management. So the focus, as you can notice on the western side of the building, is creating an outdoor congregation space. The Okanagan is wonderful weather. We've got a lot of diversity in our seasonality, and we really look to embrace that as a group of individuals in the Okanagan. So with that in mind, that's been a forefront of our design from the landscape architecture point of view, and we're looking at creating spaces for faculty and students to actually come outside and embrace all 4 seasons. With that in mind, we've got little pods where we can, with COVID and the separation of spacing of people and individuals, we've also looked at that and said, well, we can have larger spaces that one can sit, but at least there's expansive seating so that you can actually separate out if you need to, as opposed to having lots of individual pods. With that in mind, we've brought in some soft landscaping. We brought in the idea of bringing in some columnar lights that we can bring some of the indigenous culture and the art and create custom light fixtures within that space to illuminate that space, which will obviously, in the darker periods of the seasons of the year, we'll also get a lot of reflective light from the building. But if we can add to that, it will be great. As we move further left, we have the stormwater management, which is currently under discussion and design with the civil engineering group. And the intent right now is to catch all the roof leaders into a swale system, which is very familiar to most people on the campus. And that would run on the edge of the grove of pine trees, which is also an opportunity for us to hold some water at that lower part of the root system for those trees, because obviously now that the land's being changed, we're looking at ways of actually incorporating more water to be stored there for the trees too. So this system would run through on the western side of the building. Currently it would then overflow into a pipe system, which the engineers are looking at further alternatives for. And going and thinking about the wellness, and again, it comes back to a lot of situations that we talk about nowadays with mental health, etc. We've proposed a big undulating wave of a deck, which can then encompass over that the swale, but also encourage people to actually experience that wonderful ponderosa pine forest grove, and actually spend some time out there and be in the environment. When we look at the zones underneath the building, which obviously is a very different and not an unusual space, but it's going to create some interest. We've looked at the opportunity of an outdoor classroom, reflecting a little bit of the gathering circle above on the first floor, but also encouraging an opportunity to express some of the Syilx First Nation culture and history, as well as creating opportunities to the east where one can sit and engage with that eastern pond. We've created a couple of little interesting elements that we've thrown in. It's a modern campus. We're looking at bringing in modern ideas for the campus, opportunities for people to work on a laptop outside, connect to charging stations, little bar counter type ideas, have loose furniture that could be moved around, creating flexible spaces within the zone, the site. So those are sort of ideas that we're looking at with regard to furniture and bringing some language like that throughout. And then we focused obviously with regard to the planting palette. We're looking at indigenous plants only, which are local and endemic to the Okanagan. That's obviously an opportunity for us to bring in some Syilx language and botanic information, which you can wander through the site and you can do it as a learning garden. We've also proposing a specific site on the southern edge of the building, which, being quite a visual entry to the campus, would help express that indigeneity of the region. And with that, there's ideas talking around the basket weave culture of particularly the West Bank First Nation and the Okanagan Nations, and how we can do that and provide a shaded area as well to the south that would actually stand out and be quite reflective of the First Nation, with rammed earth walls just to help with the grading in that zone, and have it a little bit more light touch, a little bit more indigenous and a little bit more sort of laid back as opposed to programmatic campus design. And with that, have opportunities to tell the stories and tell the language and tell about the plant uses, etc., that the First Nations would use with the plant material we're putting into the site. And then we're trying to create that strong corridor, strong campus pathways through from north to south. We'll have trees on the southern zone, again, meeting up with the EME building, the trees along the road on Alumni Avenue, just to give some more of that strong campus avenue feel. I think that's pretty much it for now, Susan.
Thank you, Byron. And so we'll just end on this note and let everyone know that the process with the Indigenous consultant is ongoing. We have knowledge gathering forthcoming, and I think we'll just leave it on that note.